I gripped the weathered duffel bag in my hand as I approached the fishing vessel. The deep current bobbed gently against the dock, a 70-foot commercial fishing boat that would be my home for the next 2 weeks. Salt air filled my lungs as I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This wasn't my first job, but it was my first time on a commercial fishing crew. A tall figure stood at the top of the gangplank, arms crossed, watching me approach. His gray hair caught the morning light, and even from a distance I could see the serious set of his mouth beneath bushy eyebrows. "You Pierce?" he called down. "Yes, sir. Lewis Pierce," I replied, trying to sound confident as I climbed the gangplank. Up close, Captain Eugene Harrison looked exactly like what I'd expect from someone who'd spent decades at sea. Weathered skin, calculating gray eyes that seemed to be evaluating my worth with a single glance, and a firm handshake that tested my grip. "Welcome aboard the Deep Current. I'm Captain Harrison." He looked me up and down. "First time on a commercial vessel?" "Yes, sir, but I've worked construction and I learn fast." He nodded, not particularly impressed, but not disappointed either. "We'll see. Follow me." I trailed behind him across the deck, taking in my new workplace. The boat was clean but showed its age in the worn patches of paint and the dull sheen of metal fixtures that had been polished too many times. Captain Harrison led me to a small cabin that served as his office, gesturing for me to take a seat while he rummaged through a drawer. "Every boat has its rules," he said, his back to me. "The usual stuff. Safety protocols, work schedules, chain of command." He turned around, holding a folded piece of paper that had clearly seen better days. The edges were frayed, and the creases were so deep the paper was nearly falling apart. "But the Deep Current has some additional rules, special rules." He handed me the paper. I unfolded it carefully, worried it might disintegrate in my hands. 6 rules were written in faded ink, some in handwriting that didn't match the others, as if they'd been added over time. "Read them," Captain Harrison said. "Memorize them." I looked down at the list. 1. Always wear your life jacket when on deck. No exceptions. 2. If you hear someone whisper your name when you're alone, do not answer. 3. If you see a crew member staring at the ocean without responding, do not touch them. Call for help immediately. 4. If you're alone on deck and hear footsteps but see no one, go inside at once. 5. If you see a man in a yellow raincoat, do not approach or speak to him. Walk away. 6. If you spot a lighthouse where no lighthouse should be, report it to me immediately. I looked up at Captain Harrison, waiting for him to crack a smile or tell me this was some kind of joke for the new guy. His expression hadn't changed. "Sir, are these serious?" I asked. "Every rule on that list is written in blood, son." He took the paper back from me, folded it with practiced precision, and returned it to my hand. "Keep it with you." I slipped the paper into my pocket, figuring this was some elaborate hazing ritual. Every job had its own version. Construction crews sending newbies to find a board stretcher or asking for striped paint. This was just the fishing boat version. "Yes, sir. I'll keep it in mind." "You do that." He stood up. "Now let's get you introduced to the rest of the crew." Back on deck, several men were busy with pre-departure preparations. Captain Harrison called them over one by one. "This is Easton Valdez, my first mate." A huge man with kind eyes that contrasted with his intimidating size stepped forward. He had to be at least 6'3", with a burly build and short brown hair graying at the temples. "Welcome aboard," Easton said, his handshake firm but not challenging like the captain's had been. "Isaac Spencer, our engineer." A smaller man with glasses and oil-stained hands gave me a quick nod. He barely made eye contact before looking back at whatever mechanical part he was holding. "And our deckhands, Drew Hayes and Tony Hansen." Drew was older, maybe in his 50s, with deeply tanned skin that spoke of decades at sea. Tony was stocky and powerful-looking, with a 5 o'clock shadow despite it being early morning. They all sized me up with varying degrees of interest. I got the sense they'd seen plenty of new guys come and go. "Lewis here is joining us for this run," Captain Harrison said. "Show him the ropes." He turned to me. "Stow your gear below and be back on deck in 10 minutes. We're casting off soon." I found my bunk in the cramped crew quarters, tossed my duffel onto the thin mattress, and took a moment to collect myself. The strange rules kept running through my head. Why would someone whisper my name? What man in a yellow raincoat? A lighthouse where none should be? It had to be a joke. When I returned to the deck, I found Drew Hayes coiling rope with practiced efficiency. "So, about those rules the captain gave me," I began, trying to sound casual. Drew's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "Best to just follow them," he said without looking up. "But what's with the whispering names thing? And the guy in the yellow? We don't talk about the rules." He cut me off. "We just follow them." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. Throughout the day, I tried bringing up the rules with the others. Isaac barely acknowledged the question, muttering something about focusing on his work. Tony just shook his head and walked away. Only Easton gave me anything close to a real response. "New guys always ask," he said with a sigh. "Listen, some things you learn by experience out here. The captain doesn't make rules without reason." "So they're not just messing with me?" I asked. Easton's expression turned serious. "Rule 1 is easy. Wear your life jacket. The rest, hope you never find out why they exist." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Now help me with these nets." By evening, we were well out to sea. The coastline had disappeared hours ago, leaving nothing but endless water in every direction. The work had been non-stop, learning where everything was stored, how to operate the basic equipment, and the daily routines that kept the vessel running. After dinner, while the others were playing cards in the galley, Captain Harrison asked me to organize the tackle boxes on the stern deck. I figured it was busy work to keep the new guy occupied, but I didn't mind the chance for some quiet after the day's information overload. The sun had set, leaving just enough light to see by. I knelt beside the row of tackle boxes, sorting hooks and lures according to the system Easton had shown me earlier. The gentle rocking of the boat and the steady hum of the idling engine were almost peaceful. That's when I heard it. "Lewis." The whisper was so faint I thought I'd imagined it. I looked around, but I was alone on this section of the deck. "Lewis." This time there was no mistaking it. Someone had whispered my name, the sound seeming to rise from the water itself. I stood up and walked to the rail, peering over into the dark waves below. Nothing but black water reflecting the boat's lights. Rule 2 suddenly flashed in my mind. If you hear someone whisper your name when you're alone, do not answer. A chill ran up my back that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. I backed away from the rail, my eyes scanning the empty deck. The whisper came again, clearer this time, as if whatever was speaking had moved closer. "Lewis, come closer." My mouth went dry. I remembered Captain Harrison's words. Every rule on that list is written in blood. Without responding, I turned and walked quickly toward the cabin door, the half-organized tackle boxes forgotten behind me. I pushed through the door and let it swing shut, my breathing faster than it should have been. Inside, I found Easton alone in the navigation room, reviewing charts under a small lamp. He looked up at me, his expression changing as he took in my face. "You okay? You look like you've seen something." I opened my mouth, closed it, then tried again. I was organizing those tackle boxes and I hesitated, feeling foolish. I heard someone whisper my name, but there was nobody there. Easton's face grew very still. He set down his pencil and straightened up. "You didn't answer it, did you?" "No," I said. I remembered Rule 2. He nodded slowly, relief visible in his eyes. "Good, that's good." He looked toward the door I'd just come through, then back at me. "Stay inside for the rest of the night. I'll finish with the tackle boxes." "What was it?" I asked. "Who was whispering my name?" Easton picked up his pencil again, turning back to his charts. "Get some rest, Lewis. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." I stood there for a moment, waiting for more of an explanation, but it was clear I wasn't going to get one. As I turned to head below deck, I caught Easton making a small sign with his hand, something between a cross and a sailor's knot, a protection of some kind. I reached into my pocket and felt the folded paper with the 6 rules, no longer quite so sure they were just an elaborate joke for the new guy. The boat pitched and rolled beneath my feet as I struggled to keep my balance on the second day. The seas had turned rougher overnight, whitecaps breaking against the hull while spray misted over the deck. I gripped the rail with one hand, the other clutching my life jacket strap like it was the only thing keeping me from going overboard. "You'll get your sea legs soon enough," Drew said, working a few feet away. He coiled rope with practiced movements, barely seeming to notice when the deck tilted. Just keep your knees bent and move with the boat, not against it. I tried following his advice, loosening my stance. It helped a little. How long did it take you to adjust? First week was hell. After that, Drew stopped mid-sentence, his hands going still on the rope. He straightened up slowly, turning away from me. Without a word, he walked to the rail and stared down into the churning water. His body went rigid, face blank, eyes fixed on something below the surface. "Drew?" I called out, moving toward him. "You okay?" No response. He didn't blink, didn't move, just kept staring into the water with completely glazed eyes. Rule 3 flashed in my mind. If you see a crew member staring at the ocean unresponsive, don't touch them. Call for help. I backed away, turned, and ran across the rolling deck toward the wheelhouse. My boots slipped on the wet surface as I grabbed the door handle. "Easton!" I shouted, bursting inside. "It's Drew. He's at the rail, just staring, not responding." Easton's head snapped up from the charts he'd been reviewing. His expression hardened as he pushed past me and ran outside. I followed, watching as he approached Drew with quick, purposeful strides. "Stand back," Easton ordered me, then grabbed Drew by the shoulders. "Drew!" Easton shook him hard. "Drew, look at me!" Drew's body jerked under Easton's grip. He blinked rapidly, his eyes clearing as he looked around in confusion. "What?" Drew muttered, frowning at Easton's hands on his shoulders. "What's happening?" "You were gone again," Easton said quietly, releasing him but staying close. Drew rubbed his face. "I was just coiling line with the new guy." "That was 5 minutes ago," I said. Drew looked at me, then back at Easton, genuine confusion on his weathered face. "I don't remember walking over here." "Let's get you inside," Easton said, guiding Drew toward the cabin with a firm hand on his back. As they passed me, Easton gave me a short nod. "You did right, following the rules." I stayed on deck, finishing the work Drew had abandoned, but kept glancing at the water. What had he seen down there? What had pulled him into that trance? The rules suddenly felt a lot less like superstition and a lot more like warnings. Later that night, after a quiet dinner where nobody mentioned Drew's episode, I volunteered for the late watch. The captain raised his eyebrows but nodded his approval. "Stay alert," was all he said. The wind had died down, but the sea remained restless under a clear night sky. Stars reflected on the water's surface, broken and scattered by the waves. I patrolled the deck alone, checking equipment and making sure everything was secured. The boat creaked and groaned around me, normal sounds I was starting to get used to, but then I heard something different. Heavy footsteps on the deck behind me. I turned, expecting to see one of the crew. The deck was empty. The footsteps continued, getting closer. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't match the rhythm of the boat. I spun in a circle, searching the shadows. Hello? Nothing visible, but the footsteps kept coming, now just a few yards away. Rule 4. If alone on deck and hear footsteps but see no one, go inside. I didn't need to be told twice. I backed away, then turned and ran for the nearest door. My hand fumbled with the handle as the footsteps got closer, right behind me now. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. My breathing came in quick gasps as I pressed my back against the door. Through the small porthole window, I looked out at the deck I'd just fled. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a dark shape moved across the empty deck, a shadow without a source, flowing like liquid across the boards. It paused near where I'd been standing, then continued toward the bow before disappearing from my view. I stayed inside for the rest of my watch, checking the deck only through windows. When Easton came to relieve me at 4 in the morning, I said nothing about what I'd seen. The rules were starting to make sense. They weren't explanations, just survival instructions. The next day dawned gray and foggy. I helped Isaac with some engine maintenance before heading back on deck. The air felt thick, visibility limited to maybe 100 yards in any direction. The fog muffled sounds, creating an eerie bubble around the boat. As I crossed to the starboard side, I spotted a figure standing by the rail, a man wearing a bright yellow raincoat, hood pulled up. He stood perfectly still, facing out to sea. I didn't recognize the coat. None of the crew wore yellow. Then Rule 5 clicked into place. If you see a man in yellow raincoat, don't approach or speak. Walk away. My steps faltered. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged me. Something about the stillness made my skin crawl. I deliberately looked away, changing direction to head back toward the cabin without getting any closer. As I reached the door, I risked a quick glance back. The yellow-coated figure was gone. I found Eugene in the wheelhouse checking our position on the charts. "Captain," I said, closing the door behind me. "I just saw someone in a yellow raincoat on deck." Eugene's pencil stopped moving. He looked up at me, his gray eyes suddenly intense. "You followed the rule?" "Yes, sir. Didn't approach, didn't speak, just walked away." He nodded slowly, setting down his pencil. "Sit down, son." I took the chair across from him. Eugene stared out the window for a long moment before speaking. "His name was Bodie Perry," he finally said. "Good fisherman, worked these waters for years, went overboard in '87 during a storm." Eugene's weathered fingers tapped on the chart. "We searched for hours, but the sea had taken him." I waited, sensing there was more to the story. "Thing is," Eugene continued, "he never truly left the vessel. First time he appeared was a week after we lost him, standing right where you saw him, in that yellow coat he always wore." Eugene's eyes met mine. 3 days later, we lost another man overboard, same spot. "You're saying he's a ghost?" The word felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth. "I'm saying the sea takes what it wants, and sometimes what it takes doesn't rest." Eugene looked back at his charts. "Bodie appears when the sea is hungry. We've learned to keep our distance when he shows himself." I sat there, trying to process what he was telling me. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as an old sailor's superstition, but after what I'd already experienced, I couldn't dismiss it. "The rules," I said. "They're all about things like this?" Eugene nodded. "Every one of them written after we lost someone. Learned the hard way what happens when you ignore the signs." He looked at me directly. "You're doing well, following them without question. Some folks need to understand why before they'll listen. Those folks don't last long out here." I thought about Drew staring into the water, about the footsteps on an empty deck, about the man in the yellow coat who'd been dead for over 30 years. "I believe you," I said quietly. Eugene seemed satisfied with that. "Good. Keep your eyes open and your life jacket on. We've got 3 more days at sea before we head back to port." I left the wheelhouse with a new understanding of the deep current and its rules. They weren't superstitions or pranks on the new guy. They were survival knowledge written in blood, just as the captain had said. And somewhere on this boat, Bodie Perry was watching, waiting for someone to make a mistake. I noticed Tony acting weird on the 5th day. He'd been quiet since we set out, but now he spent way too long staring at the water. Not just quick glances either. Full-on staring contests with the ocean like he was waiting for it to blink first. During lunch, I watched him pick at his food. The galley was cramped with all of us squeezed around the small table. Drew and Isaac talked about some fishing spot they'd hit next week. Eugene wasn't around, probably in the wheelhouse checking our course. Tony sat across from me, his food barely touched. His eyes looked different somehow, distant and foggy. Mid-conversation, he stood up so suddenly his chair scraped against the floor. "Tony?" Easton asked, fork halfway to his mouth. Without answering, Tony walked out, just left his food and walked straight out the door. I looked at Easton, who shrugged but kept eating. Something felt wrong, so I got up and followed Tony outside. The sky had turned gray, and a light drizzle made the deck slippery. I spotted Tony at the starboard rail, completely still, his back to me. He wasn't wearing his life jacket. "Hey," I called. "Tony?" He didn't move, didn't even twitch, just stood there, hands gripping the rail, staring down at the water. Rule 3 flashed in my mind. If you see a crew member staring at the ocean unresponsive, don't touch them, call for help. I backed up and ran to the galley door. "Easton, I need help, it's Tony." Easton dropped his fork and pushed past me. I followed him out to where Tony stood frozen at the rail. "Tony," Easton called, approaching cautiously. "Hey buddy, step back from there." When Tony didn't respond, Easton reached out and grabbed his shoulders. Tony spun around so fast I jumped back. His eyes were wide and wild, pupils blown out. He didn't look like himself at all. "They're calling me," Tony said, his voice strange and hollow. "They're calling me home." He twisted suddenly, trying to climb over the rail. Easton grabbed him around the waist. "Lewis, help me." I rushed forward and grabbed Tony's arm. He was stronger than he looked, fighting against us with everything he had. "Let me go," Tony screamed, clawing at our hands. "They need me. The water. They're waiting for me." We wrestled him away from the rail. His boot caught me in the shin, and I nearly lost my grip. Easton managed to get his arms around Tony's chest, pinning his arms. "Get the captain!" Easton yelled at me. I ran to the wheelhouse and found Eugene charting our course. "Captain, Tony tried to jump overboard. Easton's holding him down." Eugene moved faster than I thought possible for a man his age. By the time we got back, Easton had Tony pinned to the deck. Tony had stopped fighting but kept mumbling about voices in the water. "They said I belong with them," he whispered, eyes unfocused. "They promised peace, eternal peace." Eugene knelt beside him. "Who, Tony? Who spoke to you?" "The ones below," Tony said, his voice breaking. "The ones who took Bodhi." Eugene and Easton exchanged a look I couldn't read. "Get him below," Eugene ordered. "Secure him to his bunk. I'll radio for emergency evac." It took all three of us to get Tony below deck. He'd stopped fighting but kept talking about the voices, how beautiful they sounded, how they promised to take away all his pain if he'd just join them. We tied him to his bunk with rope, not tight enough to hurt him, but secure enough that he couldn't get loose. Isaac stayed with him while Eugene made the radio call. That night, I couldn't sleep. Tony had finally passed out after hours of talking nonsense, but his words kept playing in my head. I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the others breathe. Around 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep. I pulled on my boots and jacket, made sure my life vest was secure, and headed up to the deck. The air felt cool against my face as I stepped outside. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like someone had tossed handfuls of silver dust. The moon cast enough light to see by, making the water look like black glass. I walked to the port side, careful to keep my distance from the rail. The last thing I wanted was to end up like Tony. Something caught my eye in the distance, a flash of light. I squinted, trying to make it out. There it was again, a beam sweeping across the water, a lighthouse. I blinked, thinking I was seeing things. We were days from shore, in open water. There couldn't be a lighthouse here. Rule 6. If you spot a lighthouse where none should be, report to the captain immediately. I turned and ran back inside, taking the steps 2 at a time until I reached Eugene's quarters. I knocked hard. "Captain! Captain, wake up!" The door opened almost immediately. Eugene stood there fully dressed, like he hadn't been sleeping at all. "What is it, son?" "There's a lighthouse," I said, pointing back toward the deck. "Out there, but we're nowhere near land." Eugene's face went white. He pushed past me and headed for the deck. I followed close behind. Outside, Eugene looked where I was pointing. The beam swept across the water again, closer now than before. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. He turned and ran to the wheelhouse. I heard the engines roar to life a moment later. The boat lurched as we changed course, turning away from the light. Eugene's voice came over the loudspeaker. "All hands on deck, now!" Doors opened below as the others stumbled out, confused and half asleep. They made their way up to the wheelhouse where Eugene waited, his face grim. "Emergency protocols," he announced once everyone was present. "No one goes outside alone. Everyone stays together. We're changing course." "What's happening?" Drew asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Eugene looked at me. Lewis spotted a lighthouse. The reaction was immediate. Isaac crossed himself. Easton's jaw tightened. Drew just looked sick. "But there's no lighthouse out here," Isaac said. "Exactly," Eugene replied. "Now get to your stations. We're getting out of here." I stayed in the wheelhouse with Eugene while the others took their positions. Through the windows, I could see the lighthouse beam still visible despite our change in direction. "What is it?" I asked quietly. Eugene kept his eyes on the controls. "Something that shouldn't exist. Something that calls ships to their doom." "Like a siren?" "Worse," Eugene said. "At least with a siren, only one man goes over. That light, I've heard stories of entire crews walking into the water, one after another." The engines pushed hard as we fled. I watched the light through the windows, tracking its position. For 3 hours it seemed to follow us, always staying the same distance away no matter how fast we moved or what direction we turned. Then, just as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the light vanished. One moment it was there, sweeping across the water, and the next it was gone like it had never existed. Eugene didn't relax. He kept the engines running at full speed, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "Is it over?" I asked. Eugene glanced at me, his face lined with exhaustion. For now, but we stay on alert. The protocols remain in place until we reach port. I nodded, understanding now why the rules existed. They weren't superstitions or pranks. They were warnings, lessons learned the hard way. I thought about Tony, tied to his bunk below, and wondered if he'd heard the same voices that called to me that first night. I wondered if Bodie Perry had heard them too, before he went overboard in that storm back in '87. The ocean stretched out around us, endless and deep. Somewhere beneath those waves, something waited. Something that knew our names and called to us when we were alone. Something that could make a lighthouse appear where no lighthouse should be. And we were still 3 days from port. I was helping Isaac check the fuel lines when we heard the screaming. It cut through the drone of the engines like a knife, making us both freeze. Isaac's head snapped up, his hands still buried in the guts of the machinery. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the engines. Before I could answer, another scream tore through the air, followed by shouting. I couldn't make out the words, but the panic was unmistakable. "Deck," Isaac said, already moving. He wiped his hands on a rag and tossed it aside. We scrambled up the narrow metal stairs, my boots slipping on the steps as the boat rocked. I grabbed the railing to steady myself, heart pounding in my chest. The rules flashed through my mind, all those weird, cryptic warnings that suddenly didn't seem so strange anymore. We burst onto the deck and into chaos. Drew was backing away from the starboard rail, his face drained of color. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror. "Stay back," he shouted when he saw us. "Don't touch him." At the rail stood Tony. His back was to us, arms stretched out toward the water like he was welcoming something, or someone. The wind whipped his clothes around his body, but he stood unnaturally still against the motion of the boat. "Tony!" Isaac called out, taking a step forward. Tony turned, and I felt my blood turn to ice. His eyes, they weren't his anymore. The whites had taken over completely. No iris, no pupil. Just blank, milky orbs staring at nothing and everything at once. "The water calls," Tony said, but the voice wasn't his. It was deeper, hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "The depths welcome you all. Join us in the peace below." I looked past Tony to the water beyond, and that's when I saw him, standing on nothing, hovering just above the churning waves, Bodie Perry in his bright yellow raincoat. The hood was pulled up as always, but I could see his face now, pale and bloated, water dripping from skin that looked like it had been underwater for weeks. His hands, those ghostly, almost translucent hands, reached up toward Tony's shoulders. "Jesus Christ," Isaac whispered beside me. "Do you see?" "I see him," I said, my voice cracking. Tony's body jerked like a puppet on strings, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, that terrible smile still fixed on his face. The voices speak truth. No more pain, no more fear, only peace in the cold embrace. The deck door slammed open behind us. Easton charged out, dragging something heavy behind him. I realized it was the fire hose used to wash down the deck. "Get back!" Easton shouted, wrestling with the nozzle. "All of you, get back now!" Drew had already retreated to the cabin door. Isaac grabbed my arm and pulled me aside as Easton braced himself against a cleat and aimed the hose. "Sorry, Tony," Easton muttered, and opened the valve. The hose jerked violently as water blasted out, hitting Tony square in the chest. The force of it knocked him backward against the rail. He screamed, his real voice this time, as the icy seawater soaked him. His arms windmilled as he tried to keep his balance. Behind him, the yellow figure of Bodie Perry seemed to flicker like a bad TV signal. His reaching hands pulled back, his form becoming less solid with each second. Tony collapsed to the deck in a heap, coughing and sputtering. His eyes, normal brown eyes now, blinked in confusion as he looked around at all of us. What happened?" he asked, teeth chattering from the cold water. "Why am I all wet?" I looked back to where Bodie had been. Nothing remained but empty air and rolling waves. The wheelhouse door banged open, and Eugene came rushing out. He took in the scene in one glance. Tony soaked and shivering on the deck, Easton with the hose, the rest of us backed against the cabin wall. "Everyone inside, now," Eugene ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Easton, Drew, get Tony below and into dry clothes. Isaac, secure that hose. Lewis, with me." We moved quickly, following orders without question. I followed Eugene into the wheelhouse, where he immediately went to the radio. "This is fishing vessel Deep Current requesting emergency medical evacuation," he said into the microphone, his voice steady despite everything. "We have a crew member experiencing severe psychiatric distress, possibly dangerous to himself. Current position." He rattled off coordinates I couldn't follow. While Eugene handled the radio, I stood by the window, watching as Easton and Drew helped Tony below deck. Tony seemed dazed, compliant, nothing like the man who'd stood at the rail moments before with those terrible white eyes. "They're sending a helicopter," Eugene said after he finished the call. "Should be here in about 2 hours." "What happened to him?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the wheelhouse. Eugene sank into the captain's chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. "The sea got to him, same as it got to Bodhi all those years ago. Same as it tries to get to all of us, sooner or later." "I saw him," I said. "Bodhi, he was there, behind Tony, reaching for him." Eugene nodded slowly. "And now you know why we have the rules." The next 2 hours crawled by. We took turns sitting with Tony, who drifted in and out of lucidity. Sometimes he seemed normal, confused about all the fuss. Other times his eyes would go distant and he'd start whispering about the voices in the water, how beautiful they sounded, how they promised him peace if he'd just join them. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived right on schedule, hovering above our vessel while a rescue swimmer was lowered down. They strapped Tony into a basket and hoisted him up. He didn't fight it. By then, he seemed too exhausted to resist. As the helicopter pulled away, Tony secured inside. I stood on deck with Eugene, watching it shrink to a dot on the horizon. "He'll be taken to a psychiatric facility in Anchorage," Eugene said. "They've dealt with fishermen like this before." "Will he get better?" I asked. Eugene didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was heavy. "Some do, some don't. Depends how deep the voices got into his head." That afternoon, we received word over the radio that Tony had arrived safely. The medical staff reported he was stable, but still mumbling about voices in the water promising eternal peace. I stood at the rail that evening, keeping a safe distance, my life jacket secure around my chest. The sun was setting, turning the water into sheets of copper and gold. Beautiful, deadly. I thought about those rules, folded and tucked in my pocket. Not superstitions, not old sailor nonsense. Survival knowledge, written in blood. The sea had tested me. It had whispered my name on my first night. It had sent phantom footsteps to chase me across the deck. It had shown me Bodhi Perry in his yellow raincoat. It had created an impossible lighthouse to lure us to doom. And through it all, I had followed the rules and survived. I understood now what Eugene meant when he first handed me that worn paper. Every rule represented someone who didn't make it back. Lessons learned the hard way. And now Tony's story would be another warning, another rule perhaps, for the next greenhorn who came aboard. The realization settled over me like a cold blanket. The sea wasn't just water and waves. Something lived in its depths, something that knew our names and called to us when we were alone. Something that could create visions and voices, that could turn a man's eyes white and speak through his mouth. And that knowledge would forever change how I looked at the ocean's vast, mysterious depths. I stood on deck as the Deep Current approached port, clutching the folded paper of rules in my left hand while my right gripped the strap of my life jacket. The harbor lights grew brighter against the darkening sky, small yellow dots that gradually took shape as street lamps and building windows. Each minute brought us closer to solid ground, and my chest loosened with every yard gained. The tension that had been my constant companion for days began to ease. I took a deep breath of the air, still salty, but now mixed with the smells of land, diesel fumes, cooking food from waterfront restaurants, the faint scent of asphalt and exhaust, normal smells, human smells. I looked down at the crumpled paper in my hand, 6 simple rules that had kept me alive, 6 warnings that had seemed like superstitious nonsense when Eugene first handed them to me. Now I understood each one represented knowledge bought at a terrible price. The whispered voice calling my name that first night. Drew frozen at the rail, staring into the water with empty eyes. The heavy footsteps crossing the empty deck behind me, followed by that liquid shadow. Bodhi Perry standing on the water in his yellow raincoat, reaching for Tony with pale, bloated hands. The impossible lighthouse beam sweeping across open ocean where no structure could possibly exist. And finally, Tony with milk-white eyes, speaking in that hollow voice that wasn't his own, telling us about the peace waiting in the cold depths. Each memory sent a chill through me despite the mild evening air. Each rule had shielded me from dangers I couldn't have imagined before this voyage. First trip's always the hardest. I turned to find Eugene beside me, his weathered face illuminated by the growing lights of the harbor. I hadn't heard him approach. "You did well, son," he said, his eyes on the approaching port. "Better than most. You listened. You followed the rules without needing to learn why the hard way." "Thank you," I said, surprised by the pride I felt at his approval. We stood in silence for a moment, watching as the dock workers prepared for our arrival. I could make out individual people now, moving about with purpose, ready to secure lines and help with unloading. "Will you come back?" Eugene asked, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp when they turned to me. I hadn't asked myself that question yet. The logical answer seemed obvious. Who would return after experiencing what I had? Who would willingly put themselves in danger again? "I don't know," I answered honestly. Eugene nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "The sea calls to those who survive its tests," he said. "Some hear it clearer than others." I folded the rules carefully along their well-worn creases and tucked them into my pocket. Whether I returned or not, I knew I would keep them. They were more valuable than any paycheck. The deep current slowed as we approached the dock. I could hear Easton and Isaac calling to each other as they prepared for docking. Drew worked silently at his station, his face unreadable. We were all changed by what had happened, but none more than Tony, who was now in a facility in Anchorage, still mumbling about voices promising peace. As the boat bumped gently against the dock and the first lines were thrown, I made my decision. I would return. Maybe not on the next trip, maybe not for months, but someday. The mysteries of the deep had terrified me, but they had also awakened something within me, a compelling need to understand what lurked beneath the waves. What were the voices that called our names? What created the lighthouse where none should be? What had taken Bodie Perry and now used his image to lure others? I needed answers, even knowing the search might be dangerous. I patted my pocket where the rules sat. Next time I'd be prepared. Next time I'd know what waited out there in the dark water, and maybe, just maybe, I'd discover why it wanted us so badly.